Hello, everyone. My name is Harun Khalid. I'm the author of the book Walking with Nanak, and I'm back with another episode of the Walking in Nanak podcast, which is a new podcast that essentially tells you the story of behind the scenes from the book, writing about the book, the thought process, the inspiration, and some other sort of interesting facts that I have from the book, and just a very interesting way for me to also engage with the book. I've never read this book after it got published. So for me, it has been an opportunity to go through the book again and to remind myself about some of those incidents, some of those inspirations, some of those thought processes that became such an important part of the writing of the book. And of course, it's also an opportunity for all the readers who've loved this book over the years to maybe like get some more information about it. So the chapter that I'm going to talk about today is chapter 4, and this is the chapter on Guru Gobind Singh. अच्छा आप इस चैप्टर के अंदर बिल्कुल एक किताब का एक नया सेक्शन इंट्रोड्यूस होता है, सो एक नया फॉर्मेट इंट्रोड्यूस होता है. सो अब तक जो किताब में हो चुका है वो ये हुआ है कि देयर इज अ फिक्शनल पार्ट ऑफ द लाइफ ऑफ गुरु नानक. We began with his mother going to an ancient Hindu temple where she prays for a child. Then there is a non-fiction part, which is essentially me going to that particular shrine, and then talking about the importance of the shrine in contemporary Pakistan today. फिर उसके बाद जो है मैं मुख्तलिफ गुरुद्वारे में जाता हूँ जो उस स्टोरी के साथ लिंक्ड हैं, एंड देन एसेंशली इट्स अ नॉन फिक्शन ट्रैवल लॉग पार्ट ऑफ द बुक, एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स इज अ फिक्शनल पार्ट ऑफ गुरु नानक एज अ चाइल्ड, देन मी गोइंग टू दोस स्पेसेस एज वेल. तो उसमें बेसिकली सो राइट नाउ द टू मेन थीम्स, द टू मेन सॉर्ट ऑफ जॉनर्स जो किताब के अंदर नैरेटिव स्टाइल जो किताब के अंदर अभी तक इंट्रोड्यूस हो चुके हैं वो हैं फिक्शन एंड देन दैट्स अ नॉन फिक्शन ट्रैवल. अच्छा, अब इस सेक्शन के अंदर एसेंशली विच इज यू गेट इंट्रोड्यूस्ड टू द थर्ड काइंड ऑफ मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट नैरेटिव स्टाइल जो कि फिर आपको पूरी किताब में वो एक बार बार वो आता रहता है, विच इज हिस्टोरिकल नॉन फिक्शन पार्ट. दिस बुक इज एसेंशली इसमें जो है वो माई ट्रैवल or let's say my interaction with Iqbal Kaisar and those conversations are not really part of this. And this is like almost written in a very academic, historical manner, which required a lot of secondary research. So a lot of books, essentially, I read, a lot of articles that I read that kind of informed a lot of these sections. So एक जो पिछला section जो है, I was reading that where essentially I am at Nankana Sahib with Iqbal Kaisar, or I'm sitting at this ancient mound, जो कि Nankana Sahib से थोड़ा सा बाहर है, where Guru Nanak is also supposed to have visited as a child and as a younger person, where he used to interact with a lot of yogis and Sufis. अच्छा, उस section के अंदर basically खत्म इस तरह होता है वो chapter के I ask Iqbal Kaisar that essentially what are the similarities and differences between Guru Nanak and Guru Gobind Singh? And so for me, like that essentially is a very, very important question. So मैंने जब आप पहले भी इसके बारे में बात की थी, so when I started writing the book, when at that time there was hardly any or let's say okay, let's maybe take it from the start. So for example, when I became interested in writing about non-Muslim history and non-Muslim heritage of Pakistan, and primarily focusing on Sikh history, I've spoken about this. There was no formal educational training about Sikh history, about Hinduism, for example, in a Pakistani context. So whatever I had to learn essentially was on my own. So by the time that I had graduated from university and did my undergrad from LUMS, तब तक मुझे actually I had no understanding of what Sikhism is and what essentially is the history of Guru Nanak and what is the history of all the other subsequent gurus. But I was really interested. There's a very strong sense of curiosity because एक तो I was always very interested in Punjab, history of Punjab, but also I was very interested in history of religion. And eventually, of course, then I started doing history of anthropology of religion, so on and so forth. But I was very fascinated by religions and their histories and their stories and how they evolve and how they kind of shape our understanding of the world. So I really wanted to really learn about Sikhism much more, primarily because it's such it is a religion that is so intertwined with Punjabi identity. And I, as a Punjabi, also felt that this is an important part of my history as well. So for me, like approaching Sikhism, understanding Sikhism was not coming from an outsider. Like for me, it was very much part of an understanding a part of my own history which had been shunned, which had been kind of ignored. So वो था. So in a way, like when I came to this book, it was not just about from the focus of trying to understand the life of Guru Nanak. वो तो of course एक important aspect था because it really fascinated me कि Guru Nanak की जो है geography, जो पाकिस्तान की जो geography है, बहुत से parts जो हैं वो उसके linked हैं with Guru Nanak. But for me, like through this book, I also wanted to learn more about Sikhism and how essentially a movement of Guru Nanak, which I till that point understood as an informal spiritual movement that didn't really have like a कहते हैं एक स्ट्रॉन्ग आइडेंटिटी उस तरह नहीं थी जिस तरह आप कह सकते हैं कि इस्लाम की है या इवेंचुअली जो हिंदुज्म की भी हुई है. I mean, of course, Hinduism also did not really have a very strong identity at that point, and that identity becomes more strong with the colonial state. But that's not the focus of the talk and the conversation, so I'm not going to talk a lot about that. But essentially, like Sikhism by the time of Guru Nanak didn't really have a very strong sense of identity. और उसका जो बहुत बड़ा example जो है वो ये है. I mean, of course, historically, it's necessarily not correct because Bhai Bala जो है वो बहुत बाद में didn't really kind of exist in some of those earlier stories of Guru Nanak. But in any way, like just to kind of give you a popular perception of how Guru Nanak was imagined. So the idea was that he had these two devotees. One of them was Bhai Mardana, who's a Muslim, and then the other one is Bhai Bala, who's a Hindu. And at one point during their travels, जो हैं वो दोनों पूछते हैं Guru Nanak से कि भाई we want to be your followers, so हम कौन सा मजहब जो है वो अपनाएं. And Guru Nanak essentially tells them that if Mardana, if you are a good Muslim, then you are my Sikh, and Bala, if you are a good Hindu, then you are also my Sikh. So the idea was that what essentially Sikhism meant at the time of Guru Nanak was something which was very fluid, which really did not have a very strong sense of identity. And I feel like for me, as I was interpreting the life and message of Guru Nanak, like that's a message that really resonated with me, especially at a time of heightened religious identities, especially at a time of heightened national identities. I feel like for me, like the whole, and of course the idea of right-wing politics, right-wing identity politics, that is very much part of our reality today. Like, so I was really approaching Guru Nanak's message through that lens, where I do see a lot of issues with these identity politics, especially when it is appropriated by right-wing states. So मेरे लिए जो है वो फिर then essentially trying to understand the message of Guru Nanak essentially through the lens where he is critical of this idea of identities was something very, very important. So for me, like how I've always understood Guru Nanak is that he was trying to move away from these very strict, rigid identities. But what is also really interesting is that how essentially how this informal, this fluid sense of identity eventually becomes a very fixed set of identity, which is, of course, Sikhism. And for me, then, of course, agar aap Guru Nanak ko or Guru Gobind ko agar aap compare karen, so then that is very interesting, because Guru Gobind essentially, in many ways, really formalized our contemporary understanding of what Sikh identity is. जिसके साथ वो हम link करते हैं with the turban, kirpan, and so on and so forth. So in many ways, like you can see that like, the contemporary, how we understand Sikhism today and how we understand the Sikh devotee today, like that identity is very much shaped by Guru Gobind Singh. Of course, there's a long history and movement. Like it's not something like which was introduced by him, but of course, there's a whole evolution of how eventually it got to a part where Guru Gobind then essentially played a very, very important role in formalizing that Sikh identity. But of course, like, even if you want to go a little more deeper into the idea of Sikh identity, then of course, like the colonial state, as I mentioned, with Hinduism and also with Islam, but also with Sikhism, then plays a very, very important role in shaping a certain Sikh identity. What does it mean to be Sikh? So, for example, even though from Guru Nanak to Guru Gobind, the Sikh identity became a little more formalized than what it was, but even till like 1920s and 1930s, it was still very much fluid from what it eventually became, which was even more formalized. And then the Sikh Sabha movement played a very, very important role in that, and so on and so forth. So essentially, this is also an important way to understand that religious identities, and for that matter, national identities or ethnic identities, or any kind of group identities, they evolve with time. Or especially in a pre-modern world, the idea of identities is very much complex, because आपकी जो एक national identities होती हैं या religious identities होती हैं, even ethnic or linguistic identities जो होती हैं, what plays a very, very important role in that is sort of having some sort of common communication. So, for example, like mass media, newspapers, books, TV, news, like this kind of stuff, education, this kind of stuff plays a very, very important role in shaping modern national religious ethnic और even linguistic identities. और pre-modern world के अंदर जो है वो आपके उस तरह एक mass production नहीं थी, एक mass media नहीं था. So the idea of having a very central identity was something which kind of was very complicated. So even though, for example, in a South Asian context, Islam had a much more formal identity than, let's say, Hinduism or Sikhism, but even then, in pre-modern Punjab or pre-modern South Asia, even what it meant to be Muslim, for example, was much more different from how it is. And different regions, different communities, different classes, different castes had their own interpretation of what Islam is and what sort of being a Muslim is. And that became more formalized then with the colonial state. And by colonial state, हम उसको link करते हैं with the modern world. जब printing press आती है, और फिर उसके बाद, of course, then radio plays a very, very important role. That comes much later. Railway plays a very important role, and then our TV and education plays a very important role. So you have this evolution of identities that, with every technological change, has kind of evolved. And I would, in fact, go on and make an argument that even with the advent of social media now, identities are becoming even more different from, for example, what they were 20, 30 years ago. So what it means to be Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, those identities are now constantly evolving, especially with social media. It'll be interesting to see what AI does to that. So anyway, so long story short, the idea was that identities have evolved, and I was very interested in looking at essentially how did the Sikh identity evolve from Guru Nanak's identity, from Guru Nanak's time to Guru Gobind. And essentially what I do in this case is like, instead of sort of going from Guru Nanak to Guru Angad Dev, so from the first Guru to the second Guru, I directly jumped from the first Guru to the 10th Guru, because I really wanted to firstly establish that contrast. Because अगर मैं सीधा Guru Nanak से Guru Angad पे जाता, from first to second Guru, then I would have not been able to make the point that I was making. And the point was really, at one point, show the contrast. Okay, so there is something has happened in these about, I guess, 200 years, slightly less than that, but about 175, 200 years के अंदर जो है वो क्या हुआ है कि Guru Nanak movement then eventually has become the movement of Guru Gobind Singh. So for me, that was very interesting. And I think I start the chapter with essentially looking at the iconography. तो अगर आप उनके depiction देखें, the physical depiction, manifestation, physical depiction or painting of Guru Nanak and Guru Gobind Singh. और मैं उसमें जो है वो एक वाक्य डिस्क्राइब करता हूँ जो मेरा पहला इंटरेक्शन था. वो ये था कि basically when I went to Nankana Sahib for the first time, which was at Guru Nanak Gurpurab, वहाँ पे एक पूरा बैनर लगा हुआ था और आपको काफ़ी पॉपुलर है, कोई भी डिपिक्शन होती है of all the Sikh Gurus. Usually उसमें ये होता है कि एक तरफ जो है वो Guru Nanak is essentially his figure is dominant, and on the other hand you have Guru Gobind Singh and his figure is dominant, और उसके बीच में जो बाकी जो 8 गुरु हैं वो आपकी उनकी तस्वीरें होती हैं. तो अगर आप उन दोनों तस्वीरों को इन आइसोलेशन देखें, अगर आप एक तरफ गुरु नानक की तस्वीर देखें और दूसरी तरफ गुरु गोबिंद सिंह की तस्वीर देखें, तो वो बड़ा एक इंटरेस्टिंग एक कॉन्ट्रास्ट बनता है. Whereas on one hand, Guru Nanak essentially is dressed in very simple clothes, and comes across as essentially a very a mystic, an ascetic कहते हैं आप, या एक जोगी या दरवेश किस्म की personality. And then on the other hand, जो गुरु गोबिंद की जो depiction है is very regal. Is almost like a king, और एक बाज उनके जो है shoulder पे होता है. He has arrow, sword sometimes. So very warrior, prince, king like depiction. I mean, of course, then you can also make a point that these depictions are not actually historically correct. And these are also essentially these depictions eventually emerged from later time, because like there was nobody at Guru Nanak's time who was maybe depicting how Guru Nanak actually looked. So these are all later interpretations, but essentially, and I'm once again not getting into that kind of detail, but essentially for me, like, it was very interesting to see a contrast here, and then trying to understand that contrast through the history of and the journeys of all the Sikh Gurus. So that's for me like a starting point. अच्छा, एक और फिर बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग है, वो ये है कि so when Guru Gobind Singh, when he forms his Khalsa, so he essentially forms the Khalsa, जिसके बाद फिर अब हम जिसमें जो है वो the 5 Ks of Sikhism are very important. Turban, I mean hair वगैरह भी, but like how we understand Sikhism today, like with beard and turban and bangle and sword, जो है वो, so essentially when he forms his Khalsa, which in a way formalizes this Sikh identity. Not everybody essentially took on to that, क्योंकि वो जो मैं बात कर रहा था कि प्री मॉडर्न रिलीजन्स और जो उसकी जो ट्रांसमिशन होती है वो बड़ी मुख्तलिफ तरीके से होती है. सो फॉर एग्जाम्पल लाइक देयर वाज नो रेडियो, there was no TV, there was no social media, but also no newspapers. So essentially, so communities. और उस टाइम हमें ये भी पता है कि जो सिख हैं, Guru Nanak is Sikh, the followers of Sikhism, they are spread all over South Asia. तो वो इंडिया, पाकिस्तान, बांग्लादेश, and in fact आपको जो है even जो modern day अफगानिस्तान है उधर भी आपको वो जो है वो फैले हुए हैं. So this was his devotees essentially, like Sikhs are essentially found all over South Asia. और उसके अंदर भी ये है and they have their own interpretation of what Sikhism is, because वो उनकी daily interaction नहीं हो रही गुरु के साथ. उनकी जो है उनको कोई directly सा message भी नहीं आ रहे. एक for example, if the Guru has a message, if it reaches them maybe 3 years later, 4 years later, and by that time it reaches them, there's a lot of room for different interpretations of how that message is sort of told to several of his devotees. So for example then, a lot of Sikhs, for example, at that point were also Muslim, practicing Muslims, and were also Sikh. And on the other hand, they were also practicing Hindus. So temple mandiron ke andar jo hai aapko ek taraf they had a picture of Guru Nanak, and then they had essentially their own ritual idols and images of other Hindu deities. So they were also Sikh, but they were also Hindu. और आपको अभी भी पाकिस्तान के अंदर आपको इस तरह की community जो है वो मिलती हैं. And I will talk about them in a minute. But what is very interesting is that essentially when the Khalsa is formed and when Guru Gobind formalizes a Sikh identity, he makes it very clear that essentially anybody who does not believe in all the 9 gurus is not really a Sikh. So वो भी बड़ी एक interesting जो है वो political statement है, because आपको to really understand why that is happening, you have to understand the sort of history, the political history of how the office of Guru has evolved. Because something I've alluded to this before, every time there was an appointment of a new Guru, there was some sort of contestation that happened. So for example, even when Guru Nanak appointed Guru Angad Dev as the next Guru, his own son, Guru Nanak's own son, refused to acknowledge him at first. And there was always this tussle when Guru Angad Dev appoints the next Guru and so on and so forth. So वो जो है वो हमेशा एक कोई ना कोई tussle रही है. And there were these parallel Sikh movements that were sort of that were rising up. And in fact, some of those movements still exist in some ways. So 2 of the most kind of prominent these parallel Sikh Guru movement जो है, एक है पृथ्वी चंद की, which starts after Guru Arjan, the 5th Sikh Guru, and the other one is of Ram Rai, who is the son of Guru Har Rai, and who opposed essentially Guru Gobind Singh's father, Guru Tegh Bahadur as well. So essentially at that point then you have these parallel Sikh movements who do not really believe in Guru Gobind, for example, as the Guru, and who don't believe in Guru Tegh Bahadur as the Guru, and they have their own जो है उनकी अपनी एक गद्दी जो है वो चल रही है. And I feel like अभी भी जो है कुछ जो है वो sect जो है वो अभी भी वो जिंदा हैं, वो alive हैं. So they have their own, so they don't really believe in all the 10 Sikh Gurus who are now become formalized and part of the sort of Sikh iconography. So then that becomes a very important part of the Khalsa Sikh identity. You have to believe in all the Gurus. So you have to believe that Guru Tegh Bahadur is also a Guru, and you have to believe that Guru Gobind Singh is also a Guru, and of course all the Gurus before that are also Guru. And that message itself shows that there were these contesting claims to Guruhood and to the office of Guru. तो वो बड़ा एक जो है important point है. अच्छा, फिर एक और चीज़ है कि Guru Gobind also then becomes a Guru at a very young age. I think he's still essentially a child. And also, like Guru Har Gobind before him, and we'll talk about Guru Har Gobind and we'll talk about Guru Arjan, because वो भी बहुत important section है about Sikh Guru history, and in fact in many ways perhaps even more formative to the Sikh identity. I feel like in many ways Guru Gobind जो है takes forward the legacy of Guru Har Gobind, and we'll talk about him when the time comes. But essentially it's also a very, very difficult time, because his father, Guru Gobind's father, Guru Tegh Bahadur, who's a 9th Sikh Guru, has been executed by Aurangzeb in Delhi, Chandni Chowk. And in fact, there's a Gurdwara there as well, which I've had the privilege to visit. So it's a very difficult time, so essentially, where you have this huge the second sacrifice. So पहली जो है एक sacrifice, पहली जो है martyrdom Guru Arjan की होगी, and we've known that उसके Sikh essentially history really kind of evolves in a very different way from that assassination, from that execution. अगर वो execution ना होती, I feel like Sikh history would have taken a very different turn, and perhaps Sikh identity would have taken a very different turn. And you can almost see parallels between Islamic history as well, जहाँ पे the martyrdom of Imam Hussein plays also a very, very important role in an emergence of Shia Muslim identity, and then of course it really shapes the way Sunni identity also evolves, and in many ways Muslim identity evolves. And उसके असरात आपको आज की contemporary politics में भी नजर आते हैं. But essentially there's this martyrdom, this execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur is a very, very important turning point. So you can see that his position is not very secure. There are a lot of external threats. जब ये भी होता है कि जब आपके बहुत से इस तरह के political external threats हों, तो उस time पे then having a very fluid identity becomes very, 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 very sort of difficult. Like you need a strong sense of identity to preserve something. अगर आपकी वो fluidity होगी identity की, so at that time essentially, especially at a very difficult time, then that becomes itself a source of a problem. So you can almost understand कि क्योंकि वो political challenges उस वक्त ऐसे थे, वो हालात इस तरह बन चुके थे, especially after the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur. And the parallel challenges that Ram Rai was creating, and all the other Sikh parallel Guru movement जो है वो चल रही हैं. So you need a very strong sense of identity. So जो political हालात हैं, जो social हालात हैं, जो cultural हालात हैं, they kind of almost merited the fact that you have to have a very strong identity, which then comes through Khalsa. So that's something which is very, very important. जब एक और जो चीज़ है वो ये कि martyrdom, the symbol of martyrdom then becomes very important. कि एक तो जो है वो martyrdom, so martyrdom then almost becomes a symbol of sacrifice, and symbol of sacrifice for a righteous cause. So it's not just essentially a random act of violence. It is a violence that is a battle between good and bad, between evil and essentially evil and good, between wrong and right, between righteousness and evil. जो मैं पहले कहना चाह रहा था. So martyrdom and sort of righteous cause becomes very important, and then righteous cause and sacrifice. So the idea is that this is a sacrifice that is important for almost creation of a righteous way of truth. So all of these symbols, so martyrdom itself can be interpreted in many different ways. There's a whole sort of literature around it. And of course, also the symbolic representation of martyrdom is very, very important to look at. But essentially, in this case, then martyrdom plays a very, very important role in shaping Sikh identity and the identity that Guru Gobind then forges. And also, kind of that is the context. Essentially, the challenges, the political challenges, are such that you need a very, very strong central identity, which really accelerates the process of formation of Khalsa and a formation of a formal Sikh identity. जिसकी मैंने पहले बात की थी, this is not something which is essentially is founded by Guru Gobind, but उससे पहले भी जो है वो it was kind of heading towards it. Like, I mean, हम Guru Arjan की बात कर रहे थे, तो even he played a very important role in kind of creating a sense of identity, especially when the compilation of Guru Gobind Sahib, जो कि उनके टाइम पे शुरू होती है, and of course also with the establishment of Harminder Sahib, Golden Temple. Like, so all of those essentially acts, historical moments were leading towards the creation of a Sikh identity, and then that kind of was formalized by Guru Gobind Singh by Khalsa, by forming the Khalsa. उसमें फिर एक जो बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग चीज़ है कि what was really interesting for me to see is कि how much of a symbol Guru Nanak had become by the time that by the time of Guru Gobind Singh, because once again, this is a book on Guru Nanak. So I was also very interested in looking at how Guru Nanak is imagined, well, today in contemporary Pakistan, but also like how Sikh Gurus and how essentially devotees of the Gurus and Sikhism imagined Guru Nanak, and how did they sort of, and what does Guru Nanak represent to them? So वो जो symbol of Guru Nanak is very, very important. तो आपको थोड़ा सा ना इसके अंदर भी थोड़ी सी वो कंटेस्टेशन जो है वो बहुत पहले ही नजर आना शुरू हो जाती है. तो हमने पहले बात की थी पृथ्वी चंद की, फॉर एग्जांपल. पृथ्वी चंद का जो बेटा था मेहरबान, एंड सो दिस इज अ पैरेलल सिख मूवमेंट दैट इज गुरु मूवमेंट दैट इज हैपनिंग एट द टाइम of Guru Arjan. And Prithvi Chand is essentially a very, very, at one point at that time, was a very, very active threat to the legacy of Guru Arjan. And what Meherban does, who's the son of Prithvi Chand, is that he starts compiling um, Janam Sakhis of Guru Nanak. And you can almost interpret that as essentially him or that movement trying to claim Guru Nanak as their own. So essentially, the idea was that we represent the true legacy of Guru Nanak. Like that is essentially where this whole, I feel like the process of writing of Janam Sakhis is kind of a testament to that. So essentially, then this connection with Guru Nanak becomes very, very important. हमने थोड़ी देर पहले बात की थी कि even for Guru Gobind Singh, वो ये कहते हैं कि then in order to be a part of Khalsa, you have to believe in all the gurus. And of course, the chain starts with Guru Nanak. But what is also interesting is that essentially every Sikh guru who writes and whose words are recorded in the Guru Granth Sahib are referred to as Guru Nanak. So Guru Gobind Singh is referred to as 10th Guru. Guru Arjan is referred to as 5th Guru. Guru Tegh Bahadur is referred to as 9th Guru Nanak. So for example, I was trying to say that they all claim that, so they all essentially refer to themselves as Guru. So Guru Gobind is 10th Guru Nanak, and Guru Arjan is 5th Guru Nanak, and Guru Tegh Bahadur is 9th Guru Nanak. And that is how they are referred to as in Guru Granth Sahib. So they are not referred to as in their own name, but they are referred to as Guru Nanak. So they're very much partaking in the legacy of Guru Nanak, and you can tell that by this time the symbol of Guru Nanak has become very, very important. It has become very, very important to claim that legacy and to be partaking in that legacy, to almost show the continuity जो है वो चल रही है उस ज़माने में. So बल्कि इसके अंदर मैंने आखिर में एक चीज़ नोट की थी, which also stood out for me, which is something I find very fascinating, is that so Guru Gobind Singh was essentially, along with being a military genius and a very, very important political figure. I mean, of course, he's also very well read and very much literate in religious traditions of his time. So he's somebody who actually has very in-depth knowledge of ancient Hindu stories, folklores, mythologies, and so on. And he actually writes about them and engages with them. So firstly, he knows multiple languages, as several educated people of that time did. So he knew Arabic, Sanskrit, Persian. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, he wrote in Persian, which also is very interesting and sort of challenges this idea of binary identities that sometimes we love to make. Persian as Muslim identity and Mughal identity, and sort of Sanskrit as say indigenous identity, and Punjabi and Gurmukhi as Sikh identity. So the idea that this is a very binary modern understanding, and in fact even post-colonial understanding of religious identities and political identities at the time of Guru Gobind it's a very different world. It's a pre-modern world. So what I was trying to say was essentially he is somebody who's very aware of ancient Hindu stories and mythologies, and he's engaging with those stories. एक जो इसमें बड़ी मुझे चीज इंटरेस्टिंग लगती है वो ये है कि basically essentially so Guru Nanak was Bedi, so he's coming from a different caste, and essentially Guru Ramdas is Sodhi, and then uske baad essentially, and then all the other subsequent gurus are then his descendants. उससे पहले जो है the idea of descendants, your descendant becoming your successor essentially didn't really exist. So for example, Guru Nanak didn't appoint his son but his student. Similarly, Guru Angad जो है does not appoint his son Guru Amar Das, but also his student. And in fact, Guru Amar Das also does not appoint his son but his son-in-law. थोड़ा सा वो फैमिली वहाँ पे एक एस्पेक्ट आ जाता है, बट उसके बाद from Guru Ramdas onwards, and is always the son who is appointed as the next guru. And Guru Ramdas was a Soti. So basically Guru Gobind की writing के अंदर वो पूरी एक वो story वो भी है कि how essentially Sodhis in these ancient times were kings and were rulers, and then that power was given by the Sodhis to Bedis as well. And then Bedis essentially promise that in the Kali Yuga, when Guru Nanak comes, the Bedis will give back the power to Sodhis. So you can almost see that there's some sort of explanation of what has happened, which of course, like I will also interpret that as saying that there was some sort of different contestations. So maybe there was some sort of contestation that is happening from some Bedi community who are saying that no, this spiritual legacy of Guru Nanak belongs to us. But of course, Guru Gobind, essentially through his writing, also saying that no, we are the real descendants, the spiritual descendants of Guru Nanak, and so on and so forth. So you can almost see that the legacy of Guru Nanak becomes a contested thing, which everybody kind of is partaking in, and there's different kind of explanations of why power now is with us, or spiritual power is now with us as opposed to somebody else. So that is something which is I find very fascinating, and also is a good depiction of the political realities, the religious political realities of that time. Just going to take a little break here and grab a glass of water. Yeah, so एक मैं चीज जो बात करना चाह रहा था, ऑल्सो द आइडिया कि जब खालसा बनता है, सो जो वो इलाके जो सेंटर से दूर थे, they didn't really convert to Khalsa that smoothly, that easily, because it's impossible for the message to get to them in time, and by the time it gets to them, you don't even know what the real message was, but it's not the real message because there's no kind of authentic, it's a very different kind of mode of communication. So let's just put it that way. So for example, जो सिंध के इलाके हैं were very far away and far removed. सिंध हो गया, बलूचिस्तान हो गया, आपका KPK हो गया, जिसको खैबर पख्तूनख्वा का नाम अब बन गया है. So ये जो इलाके हैं, ये वो Anandpur, where Guru Gobind Singh was based, उस इलाके से बहुत दूर हैं. So by that, so there is a it's highly likely that the message of Khalsa didn't even reach them, or by the time that it reached them, they kind of refused it. So अभी भी मैं बात कर रहा था कि आपको सिंध के अंदर, बलूचिस्तान के अंदर, और इवन KPK के अंदर आपको जो है वो बहुत सी अभी भी इस तरह की कम्युनिटी मिलती है जो अपने आप को नानकपंथी हिंदू कहते हैं. And the idea is that they believe in Guru Nanak. So technically they are Sikh, but they don't essentially believe in all the Sikh Gurus, and they also are Hindu. तो वो बेसिकली अभी भी मंदिरों में जाते हैं, पूजा करते हैं, and then within the temple they will have a picture of Guru Nanak along with all the other deities. So मेरा जो पहला इंटरेक्शन हुआ था इनफैक्ट ननकाना साहब में with local Sikhs. So एक तो ननकाना साहब के अपने सिख हैं जो खैबर पख्तूनख्वा से आए हुए हैं, मोस्टली हिंदको स्पीकिंग, पश्तो स्पीकिंग सिख, एंड there's a whole history to that as well. बट फिर एक और जो बहुत बड़ा ग्रुप है जो भी हजारों में है, जो गुरुपुरब पे आते हैं या बाकी फेस्टिवल्स में आते हैं, बैसाखी के मौके पे आते हैं, गुरु नानक गुरु ननकाना साहब, वो बेसिकली they don't really look Sikh, of especially at least how we understand Sikhism today. वो turban नहीं है, clean shaven है. So in many ways, I mean, they and they don't even claim that Sikh identity. But I mean, in some ways they also do. So there is the idea that we are also Sikh, but we are Nanakpanthi Hindu. So essentially, you can also see what does it mean to be a Sikh. Even today, is kind of there are different interpretations to it. And this Nanakpanthi Hindu community, especially in Sindh and Balochistan, is a really interesting sort of legacy of that time period that goes on to show that basically even at that abhi bhi wo communities exist karti hain who did not really completely take on or accept the message of Guru Gobind Singh, or in fact और शायद एक्सेप्ट किया या वो मैसेज वहाँ पे पहुंचा ही नहीं, वो एक स्टोरी है. सो and that's a huge legacy. और एक ज़माने में बहुत ज़्यादा इस तरह की आपको जो है वो communities मिलती होंगी. Over time, of course, as it became more mainstream, those identities got diffused. But अभी भी वो एक community है जो पाकिस्तान में exist करती है, बलूचिस्तान में exist करती है, who are Nanakpanthi Hindus, and it's a very interesting sort of testimony to what those kind of dilute identities would have looked like. अच्छा, एक और मुझे चीज़ I was really interested in looking at, especially when I found out कि हिंदूपंथी नानकपंथी हिंदू हैं. So I wanted to know कि were there any Muslim devotees of Guru Nanak? वो आपको openly तो अब I mean indirectly तो आपको काफ़ी मिलते हैं, मैंने उससे बात भी की है कि there is some sort of respect, there is some sort of legacy जो लोग associate करते हैं, मुसलमान associate करते हैं गुरु नानक के साथ. मैं इसके बाद में बात भी करूँगा, स्पेशली जब हम करतारपुर जाएंगे, कि बहुत से इस तरह के जो हैं लोकल मुसलमान थे जो कि उनकी कब्र पे जाते थे, मत्था टेकते थे. So there is some sort of respect and love and legacy. But I wanted to see, was there a more formal kind of incorporation of Guru Nanak in the Muslim identity? उसके अंदर आपको थोड़ी सी इस तरह वो शायद अभी मुश्किल है to identify, because I feel like how Islam as a religion has evolved is very different from how Hinduism as a religion has evolved. So it's a little more formalized, so it's kind of more difficult to have these dual identities. But I feel like sometimes वो under the radar जो है वो exist करती हैं. So for example, if you're a Muslim who also sometimes goes to a temple, for example, और pre-partition time पे आपको ये चीज़ें मिलती थी, pre-colonial time पे तो बहुत ज़्यादा मिलती थी. if you're a Muslim who goes to a Gurdwara or respects and kind of even worships Guru Nanak in some ways, then you have those identities that also existed. So they were not really as formal, let's say, as Nanakpanthy Hindu, but there was some legacy. उसकी जो बहुत बड़ी एक जो legacy है वो मैंने किताब में जिक्र नहीं है क्योंकि मैंने actually बाद में research किया था. I wrote an article about it and I've written about it a few times in different references. और essentially जो रुबाबी family है कि ऐसे रुबाबी कि basically the whole rubab tradition कि basically जो कीर्तन करते हैं at Sikh Gurdwaras. For the longest time, at least till partition, at all Sikh Gurdwaras, or at least the dominant ones, it was always a Muslim family who used to be Rubabis, who used to perform Kirtan. और ये अपनी legacy जो है वो link करते हैं with Bhai Mardana. Bhai Mardana was the original Rubabi, and we are his descendants. So they might not be biological descendants, but they are spiritual and cultural descendants of Bhai Mardana. And they took forward that Rubabi tradition. Partition ke baad, of course, with the way things evolved, that tradition kind of pretty much died. And in fact, Golden Temple, jo Rubabi the, they eventually came and they moved to Pakistan. And I've interviewed a few of those descendants. It was also really interesting कि जब वो यहाँ पे आते हैं, suddenly they're like, what do we do here? Because there is no practicing, so there's no Gurdwara where they can revive that tradition. There's no Sikh community with which they can engage. And also because of the nature of the two countries, India, Pakistan, and how identities evolved after that, it became very difficult to then kind of have that duality of identity. But जो रुबाबी रिवायत है वो बड़ी एक इंटरेस्टिंग उस लिहाज से आपको वो शो करती है कि वो even though formally this community was Muslim, but they were very much also devotees of Guru Nanak and also other Sikh Gurus. So they were Sikh and Muslim at the same time. And so you have these pockets of communities that exist. जो आपको मुसलमान कम्युनिटी के अंदर भी मिलती हैं और आपको हिंदू कम्युनिटी के अंदर में मिलती हैं. And this is essentially the reality of that time before Khalsa became evolved. This is really how many devotees were. With the formation of Khalsa, you have a more formal development of Sikh identity, and essentially that is how we understand Sikhism today. But even today, you have these little pockets and little communities that have retained a very different sense of what it means to be Sikh. And they have a much more fluid sense of identity, which is very pre Guru Gobind in that particular manner. अच्छा, एक जो then आखिरी चीज जिसके मैं बात करना चाहूँगा, and I know this sort of episode was slightly shorter than the previous one because also the chapter काफी छोटा था, was essentially then what Guru Gobind does is that he ends this legacy of Guru, the office of Guru, and then appoints Guru Granth Sahib as the living Sikh Guru. So essentially all the words of all Sikh Gurus and other religious figures. This process, of course, was started much before him by Guru Ramdas actually, and then really completed in a way by Guru Arjan and Guru Gobind Singh. So Guru Arjan essentially really does the measure of the work in comparison of Guru Granth Sahib, and Guru Gobind then adds, fine tunes a few things, and then really finalizes the whole thing, and then appoints it as the next living Guru. So then you have this central text, which then essentially becomes the center or the core of the entire religion, or the core of the whole community. In many similar way of how, for example, Quran. The role that Quran plays in Muslim identity. And Guru Granth Sahib के ऊपर भी आप काफी डिटेल में बात कर सकते हैं. But what is absolutely extraordinary about the Guru Granth Sahib, and which I feel like आपको बहुत, I can't think of a single example of any other religious text which has that, is that Granth Sahib actually has, so except for Sikh Gurus, it also has Bhagat Bani जिसे आप कहते हैं कि उसके अंदर आपको मुख्तलिफ भगत जो कि टेक्निकली सिख नहीं थे या इवन गुरु नानक से पहले भी हैं या बाद में भी हैं या गुरु अर्जुन के भी कंटेम्परेरी हैं, पीपल हु आर ओपनली मुस्लिम, पीपल हु आर हिंदू, उनके भी टेक्स्ट जो है वो इनकॉर्पोरेट किया गया है, and that text becomes sacred. So for example, एक जो बहुत बड़ा example है from a Muslim context is Baba Farid. Now Baba Farid is essentially a practicing Muslim, and there is no kind of duality of identity in that way, and he predates Guru Nanak by 250 or 300 years. And his Bani is part of Guru Granth Sahib and is treated as sacred and is treated as with as much respect as the text of Guru Nanak, as the text of Guru Arjan, and other Sikh Gurus. And so this is something which is very extraordinary about Guru Granth Sahib. जो आपको शाही थी उसका एग्जाम्पल किसी और मजहबी किताब में मिले कि basically it's a book which also in addition to Sikh Gurus also holds sacred text of other non-Sikh philosophers and mystics and scholars, and that is something which is absolutely extraordinary about Guru Granth Sahib. And I'm sure then when we talk about Guru Arjan in that section, we will talk about this in more detail. But I just wanted to sort of point that out here. So I think that really concludes our little episode on Guru Gobind Singh, and how essentially he really formed the Khalsa and formed contemporary Sikh identity, and played a very important role in sort of preserving the legacy of all the Gurus. And you can see that how that was a very much product of the political time period, of the challenges that the Guru had to face, particularly in the aftermath of the execution of his father, which was a very, very important political event that really formed Sikh identity in the way that we understand it today. So on that note, thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I would love to hear in the comment section what you think. And I'll see you next week.